At this point in the project, I have to decide if I want a static background for the entire presentation. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to do that but still be flexible enough to use static graphics or even videos as backgrounds. So now it's time to take a look at the part of the presentation that really brings it to life and makes it interesting, and that's the visuals. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover how I handle adding graphics, and there's two ways that we can approach that. One, of course, are static graphics, meaning I'm just going to take an image, whether it's a photograph, some sort of an illustration, or something like that, and I'm going to drop it on the timeline and size that the way that I need it, add whatever transitions I want, or I'm going to talk about how I use graphics inside the title boxes that I've created. So the first consideration is the background. So I mentioned previously that I can come down here to say my graphics 2 track. I can put in a single box and I can edit that, and I can add a background to that, and then that background would actually serve as the background for the entire presentation. So I could take this particular background, which I've used on this particular series that I'm working on, and what I do is I go ahead and I change the opacity, usually to 0.8. That number varies a little bit depending on what I'm going to be layering on top of that and on the nature of that. So I can go ahead and click OK. Now I've got a background there. And if I want to see what that looks like on the screen, I can take a look at that. So now I've got that background there. The only thing I would have to do is go in and adjust my text, which I sometimes do. So if I didn't want to add individual backgrounds for each one of these sections that I'm going to be doing, I would have created one title box, gone into it, added the single background as I've done here, and then I would have closed that and then stretched this for the entire timeline. And the advantage of doing that is that I don't have to worry about going into each individual box and putting a background in. Now, the other thing I could have done is I could have put the background in there when I created the template title and then copied that all the way down through the timeline. And then if I wanted to change the background at any point, all I'd have to do is edit this particular title and then go in and add the different background that I wanted to use. So that would be a possibility as well. Now, the other alternative for background is I can use a static image. I'm going to borrow this right here for a second for demonstration purposes, and I'll just navigate back a little bit. I could make sure that nothing else is selected, and I could come in here, and I can take that same background or anything else that I wanted to use, and I can drop it on the timeline. Once I drop it on the timeline, that will serve as a background. Now, the problem that I run into with this method of using a static image is that sometimes the image doesn't really fit what I'm doing. And what happens is this picture will either be too large, and when I tell it to fill, it goes beyond the visible area. And so now I can't really size it that way. If it's of a certain size and I tell it to fit that, I may wind up with dark bars at either side. And again, I may wind up with a problem of being able to align my text with it. So generally, I don't use static graphics for my backgrounds. I use the method of coming in here into my title box. I'll use the background settings, and then I will drag my background in there. And then I can position my text and everything, and that's gonna work all the way through there. Now, normally, I would stretch this out and cover the entire timeline, and that works very well. If I wanted to do a list, and I do this a lot for my lists, I may want to change the background. And if I want to change the background, if I'm using a single title that's stretched along the entire timeline, what I do is I can come back, lock all the tracks, split this, and then change the background. And I'd have to make 2 cuts. I'd have to make a cut at the beginning and at the end of the section that I wanted, and then once I've got that, I'm gonna have the original background before, and I'll have the original background after, and then in between, I'll have the ability to go in and change that. So if this was a split screen, this background that I was using a minute ago would already be there. I would go into the background settings and hit the trash can to get rid of it. Now, let's say I have a list, and this is one of the things that's been working out pretty good for what I do, is I've got a blackboard here. I can drag that over into this particular area. If I wanted to adjust the opacity, I can. Usually for a list, I don't do that. I'm going to leave it like this. And you'll notice that it's filled the entire screen. So this really looks pretty good. And then my list points are going to populate there very easily. So that's really something that works out well. So that's how I would handle backgrounds. So if you have a set background and you want to stretch that over the entire timeline, it's not a problem to split that track at some point and then go in and modify it with a different background. And that actually works out very well. So most of the time that I'm working with graphics after I have my background set is going to be in the areas of the text boxes where I'm actually adding the content. And maybe I want to arrange this around something. So in the last video, I used this here. This is kind of an introductory section. And with my monitor here, I'm not able to get it all here. So I've got these points here, but let's say that I want to actually have these points backed up with something that's a little bit more interesting visually. So what I can do is I can come down here to my graphics one, and I can open that up, and then I can decide what do I want. And because of the subject matter, I've already got a number of illustrations that are in that bin, so I could pull several items in. So one of the things that I have is the King James Version. I went ahead and cleared the background off that, and I can resize this. And this is the interesting thing about doing this way. I can actually bring graphics in, and I'm able to resize them. If I wanted to change the opacity, I would have to put it in as a background. I don't want to do that because whatever I put into a background here is going to kind of cancel out or create a problem for anything else that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here. And I'm going to say that might be a little bit big or maybe a little bit too small. I can adjust that size. So now I'm going to go back over to my points here. Just going to grab them. And I'm just going to pull them over here. So I have one line here that's kind of running off. So I have a couple of options for that. I can either shrink that down, resize it, and it will wrap. And then all I'd have to do is reposition these using my method for doing that. I try to stay inside the inner guide as much as possible. It's quite possible to go to the outer guide. That doesn't create a problem. If you're watching any of these on a larger monitor and this is going all the way out to the second guide, it makes it a little bit uncomfortable at times, or it can. So I'm going to go ahead and line these up again. All right. So I can adjust this. I'm going to go over to the right just a hair. And now with my illustration, I can go in here and say, hey, I can adjust that size a little bit. That's going to make it a little bit more visually appealing. So I can go to the end here so I can see all of the text, and I can actually enlarge that a little bit. And I can do that. So now I've actually got a visual that matches the content of what I'm talking about, just the same as I would have in PowerPoint. I could do things like rotating the image or whatever for emphasis. This image here is really kind of okay the way it is, so I'm not really going to do anything there. Some of the images that I have are composite images that I've created in Photoshop. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up one of my other projects that I have, and I'm going to demonstrate some of the things that I've done with those composite images. This is one of my projects that I used a lot of static images and backgrounds in. You can see the static images here. These were actually created in Photoshop and sized to fit here. I did a sequence here in this. This is on the tabernacle, and I'm actually populating that over time on the timeline, so that was timed with that. I'm using the pan and zoom feature here for this graphic, but some of the other graphics that I have, and this is a good example here. This is a map of the placement of the tribes. So I have this map that was created in Photoshop, just a drawing of the tabernacle. And in the text box above, I've put the names of the tribes, and I'm able to adjust those, and I'm able to position them where I want them. I can make them even, and then I could set the motions and timings there. This particular illustration here is one of the full page illustrations that I have. I was able to pull it into the title box and size it down, and then by doing that, then I was able to bring in my points, just like I demonstrated before. And I was actually able to split this title above it. You can see the split right here where it jumps from one to the other. So what I did was I went ahead and put the graphic in along with the background. And then as I populated the text, I was able to split that and then put my final content in there. And then I went to another static image that I was able to pan and zoom on. Some of the other illustrations that I've used, I can pull some of those up just for demonstration here. So if I wanted a picture of Moses here, I'd bring Moses in and I would size him correctly. And you see the little lag there. That's kind of typical. And if I had a banner up above for the section title, I could actually adjust it around that. Then in the text box above, I could go ahead and time my text, and I can even bring my text around the shape here a bit. So that makes that kind of interesting. The other images that I've done are composite images that I've created in Photoshop. I've taken several images and put them together as a composite. And I can size these however I want them. And then I'll have my banner up here. I would have my text, and I can then adjust my text wherever I want it. And if I needed to continue this illustration over, let's say that I had that illustration there and this text box doesn't cover everything, then what I can do is go ahead and I can very carefully delete this and then stretch that over so that I now have that graphic covering both of these boxes, or it might even cover multiple boxes. So I'm going to go ahead and reverse that. I might be illustrating a point, and I want a graphic in. I've got some of my 3D ovals here that I use sometimes. I can bring those in. I can size them so that they're right behind text. Get hold of the right handle. This gets a little tedious, but when I'm done, it looks good and it works well. And then I could go back into the text, put a shadow on there. I could bring another one in if I wanted to. I could even try to size that to match. I could layer those and do whatever I wanted with those. If I wanted to bring in a third illustration, I can, and bring this down. I park that somewhere like here. The thing is, it's hard to work with text and graphics if they're in the same box. By putting the graphics in a separate box, I can move this stuff around, I can layer it, I can give all of these elements a motion, and then time it with the text when it comes in. I can go ahead and adjust the duration of that so they'll match. Play it right there. So now if I wanted to do that, I could just stagger those, and I would match each one of them coming in with the text. And that's not hard to do. Just takes a minute or two to go ahead and do that. And if I want to remind myself on these what each of these is, I can come in here and do a shift end, and I could say blue oval or whatever. So I could name each of these. So if I had 10 graphics here, I could name each of them, and so I can actually track them. One of the things that can happen, if some of these graphics are large, and I have them placed, and I bring in another graphic, it's entirely possible that that new graphic can do exactly that. It can wipe out a previous graphic. So when I'm pulling stuff into the title box like this, if I already have graphics here, I want to make sure that I pull this over into an area that's clear. Once it's there, I can resize it a little bit, and now I can pull it back over this way. And if I wanted to layer that on top of the other graphic, I can. That will help me manipulate some of the effects and things. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can change the order of these. Let's say that I wanted to have this behind the oval for whatever reason. I could say order, and I could send that to the back, and it would go to the back. I could bring things to the front. I can do whatever. So that really helps as far as positioning things. And then with the motions, as I transition or bring things in, and I usually have them fading, then I can fade from back to front, bringing in the text with it, or I can arrange these elements so that they're in different places on the screen, or maybe they're going to form a chart when they're complete. The possibilities really are limited only by what you want to do and the effect you're trying to create. So all of that's quite possible. One of the things that I run into trouble with is some graphics that I've created, no matter how I size them down, they're still really, really big. And when I pull them in, I have to resize them. And you can see what's happening here. This actually grabbed two things as a group. When that happens, it's best to check here and make sure that I've only got this highlighted as being selected. And this might take 3 or 4 times to get this thing resized. And this particular arrow is really not that big. But when it comes into the title box, it really looks huge. So let's say I was going to bring an arrow in to point at the Bible there. And I can say order and send it to the back. So now as I time that, I can have that timing in from behind the oval, and it's going to point to the book. And then in the layer above, I'm going to manipulate my text. I could have text here, I could have text here. I might have text below the book. I might have several points that show up here if there's room. It all just depends. Okay, so that's the basics of handling graphics. In the next video, I'll talk about integrating the text and graphics. I'm going to show some specific examples of things that I've done in other presentations where I'm trying to arrange the graphics and the visuals together to make a better impact or make it more visually interesting. As I place text in the titles, I need to integrate graphics into the design as needed. In this video, I'll demonstrate how I use text and graphics together.